There's something truly remarkable about the British rural landscape, and if you turn to the pages of classic literature, you'll find many examples that prove this to be the case. Whether Jane Austen's Hampshire, Charles Dickens's Kent, the Bronte sisters' Yorkshire, Thomas Hardy's Wessex, or George Eliot's Warwickshire, the great British countryside plays a starring role. I'm Liam Dale, and if you'd like to see for yourself, join me as I reveal the Nottinghamshire of D.H. Lawrence. For most people, just the mention of D.H. Lawrence carries with it a whiff of scandal, especially if his infamous novel Lady Chatterley's Lover is part of the conversation. But this truly great British author, who was never fully appreciated in his own lifetime, wrote about a landscape that he described as the country of his heart, and it all started here in Eastwood, on the outskirts of Nottingham. This is the D.H. Lawrence Birthplace Museum at 8A Victoria Street, and it's been carefully restored and refurbished to reflect the age into which our author was born. Today, it certainly has a Victorian charm, but realistically, when David Herbert Richards Lawrence was born in the front bedroom on the 11th of September 1885, life in this miner's terrace was anything but rural and far from idyllic. As childhoods go, young Bert Lawrence, as he was always known, had a pretty tough time. His mother Lydia considered herself a lady and had married his father Arthur, a gregarious but poor miner, to escape her family's genteel poverty, believing him to be much better off than he was. By the time she realised the truth, it was too late, and the mismatched couple fought bitterly and would provide the inspiration for the warring morals in Lawrence's autobiographical Sons and Lovers. Arthur Lawrence worked here at Brinsley Pit, spending his life underground along with the majority of the men in the district. They had to be tough to survive, and for the refined Lydia, his rough manners and tendency to spend his few hours above ground and his wages in the pub caused violent rows. Bert was their fourth child, arriving after George, Ernest and Emily, and was quickly followed by another daughter, Ada. All of the children took their mother's side, turning against their father, and when Lawrence remembered Arthur in later life, his words were chilling. I was born hating my father as early as ever I can remember. I shivered with horror when he touched me. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like living in this tiny house with 4 children plus another on the way, and 2 adults who were constantly fighting. Eventually, a move was inevitable, but it was to an area known as the Breach, renamed as the Bottoms in Sons and Lovers. Although Garden Road today looks perfectly pleasant, when the Lawrences moved here in 1887, the kitchen opened onto a back alley where the dust and stench from the ash pits pervaded the air. By this stage, Lydia knew there was no escaping the hard life she had married into, but there was a chance for her children, and she was intelligent enough to realise that for her boys to avoid going down the pit, they needed an education. At the age of 3, young Bert Lawrence joined his older brothers at Beauvale School, Greasley, and it was far from being a happy experience. Always a sickly child, he was too frail to take part in games and often stayed at home with his mother, which resulted in him being teased and bullied. But Bert was a clever boy, and when he was 12 and a half, he won a scholarship to Nottingham High School. The council was sponsoring poorer children, covering part of the cost, but Lydia still had to find the money to make up the difference. Even so, she must have been delighted at her son's success, although the stigma of being a scholarship boy resulted in him being shunned by his classmates. Lawrence's sense of not belonging was heightened. Like his mother, he'd been educated above the community he lived in, while that very background prevented him from being accepted in the middle-class environment of the high school. To begin with, though, the boy from The Breach did well, even winning prizes. But when a family scandal hit the headlines, Bert's schoolwork went into a sudden decline. Arthur Lawrence's brother, Walter, had been tried for killing his 15-year-old son in a drunken accident, and the newspapers exposed the whole sordid story. It marked the end of Lawrence's time at the high school, as he left that summer and never returned. While Bert had been struggling at school, his older brother Ernest had been bringing a good wage home to his mother, and he'd become the apple of her eye. Ernest was employed in an office, thanks to his clerical skills, earning him not only a good living, but also a rise to the middle classes, and Lydia's prayers for a better life for her children had been answered.
Lydia must have been overjoyed when, some years later, Ernest got a position in a London solicitor's office, and when he returned to visit in his top hat, frock coat and kid gloves, he was every bit the gentleman. However, tragedy struck when Ernest went back to London, as he fell ill with an inflammatory disease and died. Lydia rushed to his bedside, but it was too late. All she could do was bring her beloved son's body back to Eastwood for burial.
For Lawrence, the loss of his brother, coupled with his mother's overwhelming grief, made this a very dark chapter in his life, and he took a job in a factory to help with the household income. The family had long since moved from The Breach to Walker Street, and it was here that the troubled young man fell gravely ill. In her pleasant bay-windowed home, Lydia was suddenly jolted out of her grief for Ernest by her concern for Bert, and she nursed him so attentively that the bond between them became almost oppressive. In fact, in later years, Lawrence acknowledged that his relationship with his mother was beyond the normal boundaries for parent and child. "We have been like one, so sensitive to each other that we never needed words. It has been rather terrible, and has made me, in some respects, abnormal." As Lawrence convalesced, he discovered something truly wonderful. Just a short distance from the coal dust-covered confines of Eastwood lay the beautiful Nottinghamshire countryside, and a new chapter opened in the life of D.H. Lawrence. Lydia set great store by religion and attended the nearby Congregational Chapel, and it was here that she met Anne Chambers. So when her new friend moved to Hag's Farm near Underwood, the Lawrences were invited for a visit. The impression the countryside made on Lawrence was phenomenal, and that first walk he took from his home to Hag's Farm with his mother has been immortalised in Sons and Lovers. The mother and son went through the wheat and oats over a little bridge into a wild meadow. Peeweets, with their white breasts glistening, wheeled and screamed about them. The lake was still and blue. High overhead, a heron floated. Opposite, the wood heaped on the hill, green and still. But it wasn't just the landscape that appealed to Lawrence. The boisterous Chambers family took him to their hearts. He became firm friends with the Chambers brothers and developed a relationship with their sister Jessie that would inspire him to create the character of Miriam Levers in Sons and Lovers. Although at first their friendship was perfectly acceptable, by the time Lawrence was 20, his family gave him an ultimatum: either become engaged to Jessie or leave her alone. With his whole life ahead of him, and knowing he was not in love with Jessie, he decided upon the latter option. But Jessie was terribly upset when he told her of his decision, as she had fallen head over heels in love with Lawrence. Leaving Jessie and Hag's Farm behind him, Lawrence again trying to make his way in education, winning a place at Nottingham University College, studying to become a teacher. When he arrived, he was full of hope and great expectations, and in his novel The Rainbow, his heroine, Ursula Brangwen's first impressions of attending university were without doubt his own. The big college, built of stone, standing in the quiet street, with a rim of grass and lime trees, all so peaceful. She felt it remote, a magic land. But the magic soon wore off. The university was subject to an angry attack by Lawrence with these words: "Spurious Gothic arches, spurious peace, spurious Latinity, spurious dignity of France, spurious naivety of Chaucer."
Yet his memories of this beautiful countryside were never far from his thoughts, and although Lawrence was prone to bouts of sudden fierce anger, while studying in Nottingham, he discovered a way to channel his furious energy. But if you want to know what he did to dampen the burning flames of rage, you'll have to join me again in just a few moments. While the other students scribbled their notes during lectures, Lawrence allowed his mind to drift back here as he started writing his first novel, The White Peacock. It recreated the golden days at Hag's Farm, and although he wasn't allowed to see Jessie Chambers alone, he did get the pages of his manuscript to her, and her comments proved invaluable.
Despite Lawrence's disappointment with his university experience, he did very well indeed, and when his studies were complete, he found a position as an assistant schoolmaster in London.
It was an incredible achievement for the miner's son born here in Eastwood, but as Lawrence battled to tame his students, who he described as wild beasts in the daytime, it was memories of Nottinghamshire he returned to in the evening as he worked on The White Peacock. At a distance, Jessie remained a faithful friend to Lawrence, offering encouragement, and she would prove to be instrumental in promoting his literary career.
As Lawrence settled to city life, visiting theatres, museums, and soaking up the cultural atmosphere, the novelist and editor Ford Madox Ford had founded a journal called The English Review. The works of such luminaries as Thomas Hardy and H.G. Wells had been published in the review, and when Jessie sent some of Lawrence's poems to Ford, he was keen to meet the budding author. Not only did Lawrence get his poems published, but also Ford believed the young man had genius and suggested he send The White Peacock to Heinemann. When the publisher accepted the manuscript immediately, paying the not inconsiderable sum of £50, Lawrence was set fair for a glittering literary career.
Undoubtedly, Jessie Chambers and the whole Hag's Farm experience had been key to this early success, and when he returned to Nottinghamshire for visits, the pair became closer, and Lawrence sought a physical relationship with the girl he'd not been prepared to marry. It proved to be disastrous for both of them, and a few months later, Lawrence finished the affair.
However, events at home were about to overshadow any discomfort Lawrence might have felt about Jessie, because just 2 weeks after the breakup, Lydia Lawrence was diagnosed with cancer. The family were, by this time, living in Lincroft, just around the corner from the house in Walker Street, and Lawrence was given permission to leave his teaching post in London to go home and care for his mother. These were desperate days for Lawrence, but he found comfort in the arms of an old friend from teacher training days, Louis Burrows, who came from the lovely village of Cottage.
Louis's family home was Church Cottage, next to the lovely church. And at this terrible time for Lawrence, the place must have had quite an impact on our author. It would play a huge part in perhaps his greatest novel, The Rainbow. But for the time being, all his thoughts were focused on Lydia. In fact, although Lawrence proposed to Louis and she accepted him, he never told his mother of the engagement, fearing that it would upset her.
But within days of the proposal, Lydia died and was buried with her son Ernest in Eastwood Cemetery. It was December 1910, and as the year came to an end, Lawrence returned to his post in London. And as he continued to teach, he poured his troubled thoughts into his autobiographical Sons and Lovers. Isolated and depressed, Lawrence had serious doubts about his engagement to Louis, but at that time fell ill with pneumonia. The illness meant the end of Lawrence's teaching career, and when he recovered, he called off the wedding.
As we return to the house Lawrence drew so much inspiration from for Sons and Lovers, we enter another key period in our author's life. His first draft of the novel was never completed, no doubt due to his mother's death. But after giving up teaching, he resumed work on the novel, as events led Lawrence in a very different direction.
Lawrence had always been keen to travel, and as he had German cousins, a plan was proposed for him to go and visit them. Remembering his old German professor, Ernest Weekly, Lawrence decided to go to Nottingham to ask his advice. When Lawrence arrived, Weekly was not at home, but his wife Frida was happy to entertain her husband's guest. There was an instant connection between the unlikely pair, and within minutes they were deep in conversation. Frida was German by birth, totally uninhibited, and Lawrence was instantly captivated.
Frida quickly became the love of Lawrence's life as they embarked upon a wild and passionate affair, often meeting in the countryside around Eastwood.
Eventually, they decided to travel to Germany together, and Lawrence was introduced to Frida's family. Her father, a baron and a military gentleman, was horrified and described his daughter's lover as an ill-bred, common, penniless lout. But Frida was besotted and refused to give him up, and Weekly was informed by telegram of his wife's affair. While Frida battled for custody of her children, Lawrence was hoping that having Sons and Lovers published would provide him and Frida with an income.
But Lawrence had been very explicit in every respect with his autobiographical writing, and the manuscript was rejected for being too shocking. Nevertheless, he and Frida continued with their great adventure, travelling to Italy, as Lawrence reworked his novel, which was eventually accepted for publication in 1913.
Frida and Lawrence returned to England for his sister Ada's wedding, and in 1914, shortly before the outbreak of World War I, Frida's divorce came through and the couple were married. Some sense of normality had been restored, and Lawrence's literary career was now prospering. But when war was declared within weeks of their marriage, it heralded yet more trouble for the newlyweds. When Lawrence's latest manuscript, The Wedding Ring, was presented, he was asked to submit again in 6 months, when it was believed that the war would be over, but all hopes of the conflict being resolved quickly were soon dashed. This left the Lawrences in final. They couldn't return to Europe, and anti-German feeling was rising in Britain, and of course Frida was German, and worse still, the cousin of the Red Baron, the German fighter pilot responsible for so many British deaths.
Moving around the country from place to place, struggling to make ends meet, Lawrence remembered the lovely village of Cottage as he transformed The Wedding Ring into two sequential novels, The Rainbow and Women in Love. In The Rainbow, Cottage becomes Cossethay, where his epic family saga of the Brangwens unfurls generation by generation. However, when it was published in 1915, there was a public outcry at the explicit sexual nature of sections of the novel, and it was removed from the shelves under the Obscene Publications Act of 1857.
Lawrence's reputation lay in tatters, but as the new year of 1916 was rung in, the couple were offered a holiday house on the Cornish coast, and for Lawrence it was the perfect place to retreat from the public gaze. By spring, as the colourful flowers started to bloom, the Lawrences had found 2 cottages to rent at Zennor, and while preparations were made, they stayed at the village pub, the Tinner's Arms.
When Lawrence was in Zennor, he wrote to a friend and he said, "It is all gorse now, flickering with flowers. And then it will be heather, and then hundreds of foxgloves. It is the best place I've been, I think."
But the Lawrences were far from being a typical couple, and the local people did not take to their exotic neighbours. The vicar at Zennor so disapproved of the scandalous pair, he made sure the authorities investigated them as spies, which wasn't difficult because of Frida's nationality. Eventually, they were expelled from Cornwall and had no choice but to return to London, where the police continued to hound them. As soon as the war ended in 1918, the Lawrences were able to leave Britain and set off on what our author described as his savage pilgrimage, travelling the world far and wide to find a place to call home.
However, it was this beautiful Nottinghamshire countryside that continued to inspire our author. While in Florence in 1927, he wrote his best-known novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, which would cause even more controversy than The Rainbow and Women in Love. But Lawrence's health was failing fast. One of his last poems, written about a blue gentian flower, suggests that he knew full well that his days were numbered.
Reach me a gentian, give me a torch. Let me guide myself with the blue forked torch of this flower down the darker and darker stairs. D.H. Lawrence died of tuberculosis on March 2nd, 1930, aged 44. This statue, with a blue gentian cut poignantly in his hands, is a fitting memorial and can be found at Nottingham University.
Yet it is the Nottinghamshire countryside that D.H. Lawrence describes so vividly in his novels that best sums up the brilliance of this creative and passionate man, who the world simply wasn't ready for when he walked these paths and told his tales so many years ago.